There is a particular kind of power that does not need to win completely. It arrives dressed as restraint. It speaks in quiet refusals, and it becomes, over time, more dangerous than any army marching in the open, because no one can quite point to the moment it took control. In the summer of 1866, a Prussian army stood outside Vienna with the road open and the enemy broken. The generals wanted to march in. The king wanted to march in. Only one man in that camp said no. And when the king would not listen, that man threatened to throw himself from a window rather than watch his restraint be overruled. He got his way. Austria was spared, humiliated but intact. And 4 years later, that same mercy would help him build an empire. That man was Otto von Bismarck. In 3 decades, he took 39 quarreling German states and welded them into one nation, using 3 wars, 1 telegram, and a philosophy he summarized in 2 words: iron and blood. He built the first welfare state in human history while jailing the men who asked for one. He preached peace to every chancellery in Europe while manufacturing the wars that made peace necessary. He predicted, with almost unbearable precision, the catastrophe that would destroy everything he built, 20 years before it happened, off by only months. Here is the question this story keeps circling and never quite answers. Can a system built entirely around the judgment of one irreplaceable man ever really be called stable? Or is it simply a catastrophe with excellent manners, waiting for that man to leave the room? Get comfortable. This is a long story, and it rewards patience. We begin not in a palace, but in a farmhouse drawing room, where a young man is about to fire a pistol into the ceiling for no reason at all. Schönhausen, Brandenburg, April the 1st, 1815. Napoleon has been beaten, but not yet finished. He will escape Elba within the month, and the Prussian countryside still carries the bruises of French occupation. Into this half-healed world, Otto Eduard Leopold von Bismarck is born to a family split down the middle. His father, Ferdinand, is a Junker of the old pattern, a country nobleman who loves horses, hunting, and the unhurried rhythm of estate life, and who is, by every honest account, not especially good at running anything. His mother, Wilhelmine, comes from an entirely different world. Educated Berlin bureaucrats, sharp minds, high ambition, and a coldness that her son would spend his life either fighting or imitating. From his father, Otto absorbs a physical, almost animal love of land and open air. From his mother, he absorbs something colder and more useful, the capacity to calculate. At 7 years old, that calculation is made for him. Wilhelmine sends her son away to school in Berlin, a city he has no love for and no say in choosing. For a boy raised on the wide skies of Pomerania, the classroom becomes a cage, and he never fully forgives the woman who built it. Decades later, men who governed empires beside him would notice that Bismarck trusted almost no woman with real authority, and historians still trace the root of that instinct back to a strict mother and a boy shipped off to the capital before he had any say in the matter. You have felt some version of this yourself, whether or not you were sent away at 7, the particular coldness of being managed rather than raised, of being a problem to be optimized rather than a child to be known. It does something to a person. In Bismarck, it produced a man who could be extraordinarily charming and extraordinarily merciless within the same afternoon, sometimes within the same sentence. At 17, he enrolls at Göttingen to study law, and whatever discipline his childhood beat into him promptly evaporates. He almost never attends lectures. He fights nearly 30 duels in a single stretch of university life, walking away with only one scar, high on his left cheek, which he will carry to his grave, and insist, to his dying day, was only possible because his opponent's blade happened to snap. He drinks with the seriousness other men reserve for their careers. He accumulates debts the way other students accumulate books, and then, every single time it matters, something remarkable happens. When the examinations finally arrive, the dissolute young duelist disappears, and a different man sits down at the desk, one who can absorb a semester of material in a matter of weeks and pass, cleanly, without apparent effort. This is not an accident, and it is not talent alone. It is the first appearance of a pattern that will define everything that follows: total indifference to a system until the exact moment the system can be used, at which point total, ruthless focus. He does not believe in the rules, he believes in the outcome. That gap between the two would one day reshape a continent. To understand why a reckless Pomeranian nobleman would ever matter to world history, you have to understand the hole he was about to fall into. For 1,000 years there had been a Holy Roman Empire sitting in the middle of Europe. Not a country exactly, more a loose, ancient patchwork of princes, bishops, and free cities, nominally united under an emperor who controlled almost nothing. Napoleon smashed it in 1806, as casually as a man kicking over furniture. What replaced it, after his final defeat, was even weaker: the German Confederation, 39 separate states glued together by treaty and mutual suspicion, with real power split between two rival giants: Catholic, multi-ethnic Austria in the south, and Protestant, disciplined Prussia in the north. This was, by design, a vacuum. The great powers that redrew the map after Napoleon, Britain, Russia, Austria itself, wanted Central Europe weak and divided, because a divided Germany could never threaten anyone, and a divided Germany was exactly what the treaties of 1815 delivered. But vacuums do not stay empty forever, and the 1840s were not calm. Bad harvests, rising food prices, overcrowded cities filling with a new industrial working class that owned nothing and had nothing to lose. Educated middle classes reading French and English newspapers and asking, with growing impatience, why they alone among the great nations of Europe had no parliament worth the name, no constitution, no vote. Across the continent, the pressure built the way pressure builds in a sealed room, quietly, and then all at once. You have almost certainly felt some modern version of that same pressure, a system that everyone agrees is not working, and a growing sense that something, somewhere, is about to give. In 1848, it gave everywhere at once. Bismarck, at this point, is not a statesman. He is a country squire, recently returned from managing his family's failing estates, a job he took up only because his mother's death in 1839 forced his hand. He throws himself into it with the same manic focus he once reserved for exam week, devouring textbooks on soil chemistry, farm economics, agricultural science. And against a collapsing regional market, his land actually grows in value while his neighbors' estates shrink. The locals nickname him the Wild Bismarck, partly for his temper, partly for his habit of firing a pistol into a neighbor's ceiling by way of announcing himself at the front door. None of this looks like the resume of a future chancellor, but a crisis was coming that would reward exactly his particular set of instincts: the taste for total war, the contempt for half measures, and a mind that had spent years learning to master any subject purely because mastery was useful. Europe was about to catch fire, and the man who would eventually control the German half of the blaze was, for now, simply watching it from a farmhouse window. February the 22nd, 1848. A government ban on a political banquet in Paris turns into a riot, the riot turns into a revolution, and within 3 days the French king has fled his own capital. It is, historians will later say, the opening shot of the most contagious year in 19th century Europe. It spreads with a speed nobody has planning for. March the 13th, Vienna erupts, and Clemens von Metternich, the man who has personally held the entire European order together since Napoleon's defeat, flees the city, disguised as a laundress. Within days, Berlin itself is in flames. Barricades rise in the streets. The Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, watches his own cavalry fail to disperse the crowds, and in a gesture of stunning, almost theatrical surrender, steps onto his palace balcony, removes his hat, and bows before the coffins of the citizens his own soldiers had killed. Bismarck receives this news not as triumph and not as tragedy, but as fury. He had just returned from his honeymoon across a Europe that felt, in retrospect, like a landscape smelling faintly of smoke before the fire arrives. To him, a king who takes off his hat to a mob is not being gracious. He is confessing weakness and inviting everyone watching to test how much further that weakness extends. His response is, by any modern measure, absurd, and also exactly who he is. He rides to his own estate, hands rifles to his tenant farmers, and prepares to march an improvised peasant militia to Berlin to save a king from a revolution the king himself seems ready to accommodate. When he reaches the regular army's camp, the officers greet him with barely concealed amusement and suggest, politely, that he take his farmers home and bring potatoes next time. Here is where the story could have ended, as a footnote about an eccentric nobleman who once tried to fight a revolution with a wagon full of pitchforks. Instead, it becomes his entrance. The failed peasant army makes him a known quantity among Prussia's terrified conservatives, and when the king calls elections for an assembly to write a new constitution, Bismarck wins a seat. Inside that assembly, the defining contradiction of his entire career appears for the first time, fully formed. He does not believe in parliaments. He thinks representative government is, at best, a dangerous indulgence and, at worst, a weapon aimed at the monarchy he has sworn his life to. And yet here he is, inside the very institution he despises, discovering that it can be used, that a man who understands a parliament's mechanics can bend it to purposes its own architects never intended. He does not become a democrat. He becomes something more useful to himself, a man who has learned that ignoring an assembly is impossible, but that maneuvering one is entirely possible. By 1851, the revolutions across Europe have collapsed almost everywhere, crushed or exhausted. Bismarck's reward for years of loud, uncompromising royalism is an appointment as Prussia's envoy to the Frankfurt Diet, the Federal Assembly where German states negotiate their shared affairs under Austrian chairmanship. On his very first morning in that chamber, he watches the Austrian delegate light a cigar, a small privilege reserved by unspoken custom for Austria alone. Bismarck says nothing. He simply takes out his own cigar and lights it. The gesture costs him nothing and tells you everything. He has just decided, quietly and without asking anyone's permission, that Prussia is no longer junior to anyone. What Bismarck builds over the next 11 years is not a system anyone can see from the outside, because for most of that time he is not building it in Berlin, he is building it in exile, first Frankfurt, then, from 1859, as ambassador in St. Petersburg, and finally, briefly, in Paris. This matters more than almost anything else in his early career, and it is the part the popular story skips. The wild young duelist who never attended a lecture becomes, in his 40s, one of the most disciplined students of power that European diplomacy has ever produced. He simply chooses his own curriculum. In Frankfurt, he spends 6 years mapping every delegation's weaknesses and ambitions, filing dispatches back to Berlin so sharp that his superiors begin using them as their own analysis. In St. Petersburg, he forms a genuine friendship with the Russian foreign minister, learns enough of the language to follow conversation without a translator standing between him and the truth, and reaches a conclusion that will matter enormously later. Russia has no real interest in blocking a Prussian-led unification of Germany, provided its own eastern interests are respected. In Paris, briefly, he studies Napoleon III in person and comes away convinced of 2 things: that French power is thinner than its reputation, and that the emperor himself is a man of considerable ambition and insufficient judgment to see those ambitions through. Put these pieces together and you can see, for the first time, the full architecture of what Bismarck is quietly assembling. Not a plan for a single battle, but a working map of an entire continent's pressure points. Who wants what? Who fears what? And which cracks, pressed at exactly the right moment, will open. This is the mid-career transformation that made everything after it possible, and it happened almost entirely out of public view. While Berlin argued about budgets, its wandering, unpopular ambassador was quietly turning himself into the only man in Europe who understood the whole board at once. In 1857, King Friedrich Wilhelm suffers a stroke that leaves him unable to govern, and his brother Wilhelm assumes the regency. This new Wilhelm regards Bismarck as talented, certainly, and far too difficult to control, which is precisely why he keeps him posted abroad, in what everyone understands to be a kind of gilded exile. Nobody in Berlin, least of all Wilhelm himself, has any idea that the exile is finishing his education. To understand what happens next, you have to sit, uncomfortably, inside Bismarck's own worldview, rather than judging it from the outside. He was not a Democrat pretending otherwise, and he was not, in his own mind, a cynic either. He believed, with the total sincerity of a man raised in Prussian Protestant tradition, that service to the crown was a moral calling, not a career move, a debt owed to something larger than himself. He believed monarchy was not simply a historical accident, but the only structure capable of holding a fractured society together against its own worst impulses. And he believed, this is the part modern audiences find hardest to sit with, that ideals unaccompanied by power are not just useless, but actively dangerous, because they promise things they cannot deliver and then blame the state when reality intervenes. This was the philosophy history remembers as Realpolitik, though Bismarck himself rarely used the word. Politics, in his formulation, was the art of the possible, not the art of the ideal, not the art of the righteous, but a cold, continuous negotiation with what circumstances would actually allow. A weak state, he argued, could not deliver freedom or justice to anyone. Only a strong one could deliver either. This is why he could describe himself, without any sense of contradiction, as a conservative who would go on to demolish the conservative order of Europe piece by piece. Consistency of methods was never the point for him. Consistency of purpose was. It is worth pausing on how radical this actually was for his own class. Most of Bismarck's fellow Junkers wanted the clock turned back to before 1848, a return to the old certainties, the old deference, the old quiet. Bismarck looked at the same wreckage and reached a completely different conclusion. That world was gone, permanently, and the only real question left was who would build whatever came next, and in whose interest. While his peers dreamed backward, he was already looking forward, calculating how a monarchy could survive precisely by learning to speak the new language of nationhood, representation, and rights, without ever actually surrendering real power to any of them. This is the uncomfortable empathy this story asks you to sit with for a moment. Bismarck was not a man twirling a mustache in service of evil for its own sake. He was a man utterly convinced that the alternative to his own hard hand was chaos, foreign domination, and the slow dissolution of everything he considered worth preserving. And he was prepared to pay almost any price, including the deaths of tens of thousands of men he had never met, to prevent it. Understanding that conviction does not excuse what followed, but without understanding it, nothing that followed makes any sense at all. September the 23rd, 1862, King Wilhelm I is, by his own private admission, finished. For nearly 2 years, his liberal-dominated parliament has refused to fund the army reforms he considers essential to Prussia's survival, and the deadlock has hardened into a full constitutional crisis. Advisors are whispering the word abdication. The king is drafting the paperwork. Into this collapsing room walks a man just returned from the Paris embassy, summoned as a last resort by a war minister who believes he alone has the nerve for the job. Bismarck listens to the king's despair and tells him, simply, that the crisis has a solution, that abdication is unnecessary, and that he is prepared to take responsibility for the budget himself. Wilhelm, who has spent years regarding this particular subordinate as brilliant and dangerously unpredictable in roughly equal measure, has run out of alternatives. He accepts. Bismarck is 47 years old. A week later, he stands before the Parliamentary Budget Committee. Not a triumphant crowd, just a hostile room of a few dozen Liberal deputies who have been blocking the king's military spending since the decade began. What he tells them will outlive every other sentence he ever speaks. The great questions of the age, he says, will not be decided by speeches and majority votes. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood. The room does not applaud, it erupts. Indignation, accusations of tyranny, opposition newspapers printing the phrase as a threat against the Constitution itself. Bismarck is unmoved because he has not made a threat. He has stated a diagnosis. States, in his view, advance through the strength of their institutions and their willingness to use that strength at the correct moment. Parliamentary rhetoric simply dresses that same reality in nicer language without changing it. What follows is not eloquence, it is engineering. The Prussian constitution, it turns out, specifies exactly how a budget should be approved, but says nothing about what happens if government and parliament remain deadlocked indefinitely. Bismarck seizes the gap. In the absence of an agreed budget, he argues, the government retains the right to keep collecting taxes under the previous year's approved figures. It is a legally audacious reading, arguably incompatible with the Constitution's spirit, but impossible to disprove outright on its letter. He simply does it, year after year, and the army gets its money regardless of what Parliament says. This is the moment the country squire becomes the statesman the history books remember, and here is the question worth sitting with as this section closes. If a leader breaks the letter of the law only in the gaps the law itself never anticipated, and if the institutions built to stop him simply cannot, has the law failed, or has it simply been read by someone more patient than the men who wrote it? With money now flowing regardless of Parliament's objections, the transformation of the Prussian army becomes total. Infantry service stretches to 3 years, cavalry to 4, military spending rises by roughly a quarter. But the real revolution is not in the numbers, it is in the machine itself. Working in near-perfect coordination with the army's chief of staff, Helmuth von Moltke, Bismarck helps build a force capable of something almost no European power has yet mastered, mobilizing enormous numbers of men, by rail, with a speed and precision the rest of the continent has not begun to imagine. While the generals build hardware, Bismarck builds isolation. Quietly, patiently, one relationship at a time. He reassures Napoleon III in Paris that a stronger Prussia poses no threat to France. He keeps the channel to St. Petersburg warm. He courts the smaller German states with a rotating mixture of pressure and flattery, convincing them one by one that their futures are safer inside Prussia's orbit than outside it. The opposition at home never stops calling the government unconstitutional, and on the narrow legal point, they are not entirely wrong. Bismarck rarely bothers to contest that argument directly. Instead, he reframes the whole debate. Principles, he tells them, are a luxury Prussia cannot yet afford. A weak state, he insists, can guarantee neither liberty nor justice to anyone. Only a strong one can guarantee either. It is an argument liberals find morally intolerable, and one that a growing share of ordinary Prussians, watching their neighbors to the west and south, find increasingly persuasive. There is a private letter from this period that tells you something the public speeches never do. In the spring of 1866, with war against Austria now effectively certain, Bismarck writes to his wife Johanna describing the weight of what is coming. Men who will die because of choices he alone has made, a future that no formula can guarantee. He was not a man blind to the human cost of his own decisions. He was a man who had decided, deliberately and with open eyes, that the cost was worth carrying. There is a meaningful difference between a politician who feels nothing and a politician who feels the full weight of it and proceeds regardless. And whichever one Bismarck was, he was never, even by his harshest critics, accused of the first. For all the elegance of Bismarck's diplomacy, the machine he built existed for one purpose: to be used on other human beings. It is worth stopping the strategy for a moment and looking at exactly who paid for it. July 1866. Near the Bohemian village of Sadowa, the Prussian and Austrian armies collide in a single day that will decide the fate of German unification. Moltke's rail-fed mobilization does exactly what it was built to do. By nightfall, Austria has lost roughly 40,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured, the worst single-day defeat the Habsburg military has suffered in generations. Villages around the battlefield fill overnight with the wounded of an army that no longer has anywhere organized to put them. This is not an abstraction happening to armies on a map. It is tens of thousands of specific men, sons, husbands, conscripted farmers from Bohemia and Moravia who had no vote in the decision that put them on that field, lying in improvised field hospitals while the men who sent them there calculate the diplomatic terms of the peace. 4 years later, the price moves west. When the Franco-Prussian War ends with the siege of Paris in the winter of 1870, it is not soldiers alone who suffer. The city is bombarded and starved for months. Ordinary Parisians eat what they can find, including, by the later weeks of the siege, the animals of the city zoo. Alsace and Lorraine, ceded to the new German Empire in the peace that follows, become homes to a generation of French families who wake up one morning German against their will, and to a resentment that will not fade in a decade, or 2, or 3. None of this happened because Bismarck was indifferent to the men and families it touched. It happened because, in his own calculation, unification and stability were worth precisely this price, and precisely this much of somebody else's suffering. That calculation is exactly where the moral argument about him still lives today. Not in whether he caused suffering, which nobody disputes, but in whether the outcome, a stable and eventually prosperous German nation, justified paying for it with lives that were never his to spend. His admirers make their strongest case first, and it deserves to be heard in full. Before Bismarck, there was no Germany. Only 39 quarreling fragments perpetually vulnerable to whichever great power wanted to meddle in Central Europe. He unified them in less than a decade, largely through calculation rather than blind aggression, and once unification was achieved, he stopped. Unlike the men who would later inherit his empire, Bismarck did not chase endless conquest. He spent the next 2 decades of his career not on new wars but on an elaborate architecture of peace, alliances, congresses, careful balancing acts designed for one purpose: to keep the continent from tearing itself apart. And in an era when workers across industrializing Europe had no safety net of any kind, he built the first one, guaranteeing sick pay, injury compensation, and old age pensions to millions of people who had never had either, decades before Britain or France would attempt anything comparable. His critics answer with an equally serious case. The state Bismarck built was authoritarian to its core. The parliament he manipulated so skillfully answered to the emperor, not to the voters who elected it. Civil liberties bent whenever raison d'etat required it. The anti-socialist laws jailed and exiled political organizers for the crime of representing industrial workers. The Kulturkampf, his campaign against the Catholic Church, stripped millions of German Catholics of basic religious freedoms for the better part of a decade before Bismarck himself, defeated by the strength of what he had underestimated, quietly began dismantling it. And the diplomatic system he built, brilliant as it was, depended entirely on his own singular judgment to function, which meant it was never actually built to last. Neither case fully answers the other, and this script will not pretend to settle it for you. What can be said honestly is this: Bismarck was a conservative who overturned nearly everything conservative Europe once stood for, a monarchist who used the tools of nationalism and mass politics more skillfully than any republican of his era, and a man who built lasting institutions for millions of people he never met, while denying basic freedoms to millions of others in the very same decade. Whether that balance sheet reads as tragedy or triumph may depend less on the facts of his life than on what each generation that judges him is most afraid of losing. July 13th, 1870. In the resort town of Bad Ems, King Wilhelm is taking the waters when the French ambassador, Count Vincent Benedetti, intercepts him on his morning walk with an unusually blunt demand: a personal guarantee that no Hohenzollern prince will ever again be a candidate for the Spanish throne. Wilhelm, polite as always, declines to bind himself to anything so permanent, and the two men part coolly. A junior official named Heinrich Aberken writes up the exchange and telegraphs it to Bismarck in Berlin. Bismarck reads the telegram at dinner with his war minister and his chief of staff, both of whom, according to his own later account, sit in stunned silence at what he is about to do. He does not add a single word. He does not invent a single fact. He simply cuts, trims the same true events down to their sharpest, coldest form, so that a polite royal refusal reads, to any newspaper reader in Paris or Berlin, like a calculated insult. When he reads the shortened version aloud to his dinner guests, Moltke remarks that it now sounds less like a parley and more like a flourish thrown down in answer to a challenge. That is precisely the effect Bismarck intended. He releases it to the press that same night. By the next morning, it is in every newspaper in Europe. The French public reads it as humiliation. The German public reads it as vindication. Within 6 days, on July the 19th, the Second French Empire declares war on Prussia, exactly and only because Bismarck needed France to be seen as the aggressor. If Prussia had struck first, the southern German states, still uncommitted to full unification, might well have stayed neutral. An attacked Prussia, on the other hand, could call on German brotherhood, and it worked instantly. Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, all of them rally to Berlin's side within days. This is the section where the strategy stops being abstract and becomes something you can watch happen in real time. A single document, edited without a single fabricated word, close enough to the truth to survive scrutiny and sharp enough to start a war. It remains one of the starkest demonstrations in modern history of how a small, precise act of editing can move armies more reliably than any speech ever could. January the 18th, 1871. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, built 2 centuries earlier by Louis XIV to broadcast the glory of France to the world, rows of German officers in gala uniform stand beneath crystal chandeliers as King Wilhelm I is proclaimed Emperor of a unified Germany. The location is not an accident. Bismarck chose it deliberately, understanding, with cold precision, that humiliation leaves scars deeper and longer lasting than any battlefield defeat, and that this particular ceremony would speak to generations not yet born in a language no treaty could match. And yet witnesses in the room that day remember something unexpected on Bismarck's own face. Not triumph, something closer to distraction, a man who has just completed a decade-long project and is already, quietly, calculating what it will cost him next. The peace terms that follow are, by Bismarck's own later admission, harsher than the terms he gave Austria 5 years earlier, and he understood the difference perfectly well even as he signed off on it. France surrenders Alsace and Lorraine. France pays an indemnity of 5 billion francs. German troops remain on French soil until the debt is settled. Where he had shown Austria calculated mercy, precisely because a humiliated Austria might one day be needed as a friend, he showed France none of it, because France, in his estimation, no longer needed to be courted. It needed to be neutralized. He knew exactly what he was planting. A France stripped of 2 provinces in the heart of its own gloating enemy's greatest ceremonial hall does not simply accept the loss and move on. It nurses the grievance, generation after generation, until the debt comes due. Bismarck understood this as clearly as anyone in Europe, and he built his empire anyway, betting that his own diplomatic genius could manage the resentment he was creating for as long as he personally remained in power. It was, in hindsight, both the single greatest strategic risk of his career and the one flaw in the entire architecture that no treaty, no alliance, and no amount of personal brilliance could ever fully repair. Step back now from the individual man, because his story is also a story about something larger than any one person. What happens when an entire political system is built to depend on one irreplaceable mind? The empire Bismarck constructed was not a democracy pretending to be something else. It had a parliament, the Reichstag, elected by a remarkably broad franchise for its era, and that parliament had almost no power over foreign policy, military spending beyond a fixed baseline, or the appointment of the government that actually ran the country. The Chancellor answered to the Emperor. The Emperor answered to no one. It was, structurally, a system explicitly engineered to produce exactly what it produced. Extraordinary effectiveness, so long as the man occupying the Chancellor's office understood every moving part of the machine, and catastrophic fragility the instant that man was gone. This is worth connecting directly to your own moment, because the same structural question shows up again and again across history, and, more quietly, across the institutions you deal with every week. When you see an organization, a country, or even a company whose success seems to depend entirely on one person's judgment, when the org chart says one thing but everyone quietly understands that nothing important happens without a single individual's approval, you are looking at a Bismarckian system, whether or not anyone involved would use that word. It can produce brilliant results for exactly as long as that person remains sharp, present, and correct. And it produces very little protection against the day they are not. The tragedy embedded in Bismarck's own system is that he knew this better than anyone alive, and built it that way regardless. His network of alliances, the shifting, occasionally contradictory web of treaties with Austria, Russia, and Italy that kept Europe at peace for nearly 2 decades, was a masterpiece of personal management, requiring constant, delicate adjustment that only he fully understood. No successor, however capable, could simply inherit it the way one inherits a filing cabinet. It had to be actively operated, continuously, by someone who held the entire structure in his own head. When that operator left the stage, there was no manual for what he had built, only a system that quietly assumed he would always be the one running it. Bismarck's fall, when it finally comes, is almost anticlimactic compared to everything that preceded it. No war, no coup, just an old man losing an argument to a young emperor over a technical point of bureaucratic protocol. Wilhelm I dies in March of 1888 at the age of 90, and the throne passes to his son Friedrich, already dying of throat cancer, who reigns just 99 days before he too is gone. Germans will later remember 1888 as the year of the 3 emperors. The throne finally settles on Wilhelm II, 29 years old, impatient, and utterly unwilling to be managed by a chancellor who had served both his grandfather and his father. The final rupture in March of 1890 comes over how to handle striking workers and the growing social democratic vote. Wilhelm wants conciliation. Bismarck privately wants confrontation sharp enough to justify crushing the socialists outright. And when he cannot win that argument, he loses his temper badly enough to say so out loud. Days later, Wilhelm strips him of a procedural privilege that lets ministers report directly to the crown instead of through the chancellor, and Bismarck understands immediately what it means. The emperor does not want a chancellor who governs, he wants a chancellor who obeys. On March the 18th, Bismarck resigns. A British magazine captures the moment in a single cartoon a few days later. A young officer standing confidently on a ship's bridge, a massive, unmistakable figure climbing down the ladder toward a waiting boat. The caption reads, simply, dropping the pilot. Everyone in Europe understands exactly who the pilot is. What follows is the part of the story you are living inside of right now, whether you have thought of it that way before or not. The complex, deliberately contradictory network of alliances Bismarck spent 2 decades tending was not renewed by the men who came after him. Wilhelm's advisors found it too complicated, too legally awkward, and let the delicate agreement with Russia quietly lapse. Within 2 years, Russia and France, the exact combination Bismarck had spent his entire career preventing, signed a military alliance of their own. The precise machinery he built to keep Europe stable required his personal maintenance to function at all, and the moment that maintenance stopped, the continent began drifting, slowly and then all at once, toward exactly the collision he had spent 30 years working to prevent. At Friedrichsruh, the estate where he spends his last 8 years writing memoirs and receiving a steady stream of journalists who treat him less like a retired official and more like an oracle, Bismarck keeps making the same prediction, in slightly different words, to anyone who will sit still and listen. Without the alliance with Russia, he says, France will find new friends. Without careful handling, the emperor's ambitions will collide with too many rivals at once. In an interview given in 1897, he states it as plainly as a man can state anything. The catastrophe will arrive roughly 20 years after his own departure from power, if things continue as they are going. He dies at Friedrichsruh on July 30th, 1898, at 83 years old. The catastrophe he named begins in August of 1914 and ends in November of 1918. Almost exactly 20 years later, ignited, as he had guessed decades earlier, by some quarrel in the Balkans, nobody in Western Europe had bothered to take seriously. This is where the story stops offering answers and starts asking the question it was building toward all along. Bismarck did not cause the First World War. He had been dead for 16 years when it began, and the men who actually made the fatal decisions of 1914 bear their own full weight of responsibility. But he built a system of European stability so intricate, so personally calibrated, that it functioned brilliantly for as long as he alone operated it, and he never built anything durable enough to survive his own absence. Is that a flaw in the man, or a flaw baked permanently into any system that concentrates that much judgment in a single set of hands? When peace depends entirely on one person's continued genius, was it ever really peace at all? Or only a very long, very well-managed pause? Return for a moment to that image from the very beginning of this story, the Prussian army standing at the gates of Vienna in 1866, generals straining for permission to march in and finish what they had started, and one man saying no. At the time, that refusal looked like mercy. Understood now, against everything that came after, it looks like something closer to the truest self-portrait Bismarck ever gave us without meaning to. He was never, at any point in his career, interested in total victory for its own sake. He wanted exactly enough force to bend the outcome his way, enough restraint afterward to keep the defeated at the table rather than driving them toward permanent revenge. It worked, brilliantly, for Austria. He would forget that same lesson entirely when it came to France, and Europe would spend the next 70 years paying the difference. The cartoon that marked his fall showed a ship's pilot climbing down a ladder while a confident young officer took the wheel behind him. What the cartoonist could not have known, and what nobody in that room in 1890 fully understood, was that the ship itself had never actually been built to sail without him. Not because Bismarck was irreplaceable in some mystical sense, but because he had never once, in nearly 30 years of extraordinary work, built the instruments that would let anyone else read the water the way he could. Modern Germany exists because of what one man built between a farmhouse and a hall of mirrors. It nearly did not survive what he left unbuilt. Somewhere between those two facts sits the real portrait of Otto von Bismarck. Not the Iron Chancellor of the statues, not the villain of the simpler version of this story, but a man who spent his life proving that a single extraordinary mind can hold a continent together, and who left, without ever quite meaning to, the clearest possible proof of exactly how much is lost the moment that mind is gone.